Thank you. Yeah, just by the show of hands, whoever felt that their UI5 application is running slowly when you start up the application? Okay, it's a lot of you. I also had the same feeling when I started developing the application that I'm currently developing at work. Only the grunt build was available, and it always bundled the full library that I was using for my application. So even if I'm only using SAP UI core, SAP.m library, in the end, for the initial load of my application, I was loading 8 megabytes of resources. And this is just too much, especially if you're not only in an office network here in Europe or in North America, but if you're developing applications which are supposed to be used in other countries, like India, for example, where most people access the internet via mobile devices, and they don't have LTE or 5G connections, but rather they use 3G connections, and not always fast 3G connections, but also slow 3G connections. So then I was... Okay, got the mic fixed. Yeah, so I wondered, how can I improve the build of my application so for the initial startup it can be faster? And I'm working on some React projects on the side, and there I was using Webpack to bundle my applications. And I thought, maybe it's possible to bundle a UI5 application with Webpack and only include the files that I really need for my application to start up. Yeah, and with this, welcome to my presentation, Bundling UI5 Applications with Webpack. My name is Christoph Kraemer. I'm a front-end developer at the SAP Innovation Center in Palo Alto. And we explore new technologies there and try to fit them into SAP products. And that's why we also got some extra time to try to also optimize some UI tools that we are using. I've been with SAP quite a time. I actually worked in the UI5 core team back in 2012, 2013, before I switched teams to not only build the framework, but use the UI5 framework to build applications. So let's start with a demo and look how the UI5 applications are currently built. And we are using the UI5 sample application, as you can find it on the public GitHub. So I have to say that with this application here, I'm now using the latest UI5 tooling, where the UI5 team did a really good job already in improving the bundle size. So here we don't have the load by library anymore, but we have the self-contained bundle, which already only includes the file that are necessary for the application. Still, we're going to have a look at the network tab, and I can increase the size a little bit for you so that you can see it. And we have a look at like all the files. Like there's an index.html loaded in the beginning, then the custom JS file, the styles, and so on, whatever is needed for the application. And Chrome DevTools have a nice feature called coverage, and we can check actually when we reload the application now, how much of the JavaScript that we are loading is actually executed while we are running the application. And as you can see here, only for the JavaScript part, not only not talking about style sheets, they are even worse. We are loading 2.2 megabyte of resources, but 1.5 megabyte of these resources are not even touched to render this screen. And I thought this has to be done better. And also I have to find out where all this data comes from. What is loaded for the initial load to bring up this application. So I started thinking about Webpack. So maybe not everyone has heard of Webpack before. What is it? It's a tool that a module bundler for JavaScript files, which basically concatenates different JavaScript modules into one bigger file or multiple bigger files to make it easier to actually load the application. And it's a very extensible tool. So with different plugins and loaders, you can enhance the application so that we can use also other files, not only JavaScript files, but we could, for example, also include styles, less files, SAS files, and so on, right at the point where we need them in the application. And it's a tool that's used for most, or by most of the React developers, Vue.js developers, and it's even baked into the Angular tools to bundle these applications. And I thought it would be fine to or nice to also make it possible to build the UI5 application with this tool. So what does it do? The code, you basically have an entry point of your application, and then Webpack statically analyzes the code and all the dependencies of the code, and it doesn't matter what kind of module you are loading or what you have installed in your Node modules. These can be CommonJS modules, AMD modules, the latest ES6 modules, Require.js modules. All of this can be loaded and bundled together in an application. And from all these dependencies that are found, a dependency graph is built, and only the files that are in this dependency graph are in the end put into the final bundle of the application. And there is another nice feature about Webpack. It enables so-called code splitting. This means that you do not have to load all the code that you need for your application in the beginning, but rather use dynamic import statements in your code to delay the loading of code. For example, if you have a big application with multiple routes, you can build the application like this, that only the code is loaded as soon as you enter a route. So if a user of your application never, for example, comes to a screen where you're using the charting library, then the charting library is never loaded and we don't blow up the initial load of the application. This is the nice thing about Webpack, that you don't bundle the whole thing by whatever library you're using, but you can configure or you can build your application that it's actually bundled by your application structure. So you have the power to specify your own breakpoints to load the code when you know it's needed to run the application, and not load everything right in the beginning. And with all of this, we have a faster initial load. We have less requests in total that are sent to the server, and we save some server round trips. And all in all, less JavaScript is transferred, which also means that by your web browser, less JavaScript code has to be parsed and evaluated before it can be executed. So let's have a demo at the same application we just saw. Okay, before we look at the demo, we have one more thing. So yeah, I was thinking what has to be done with Webpack so we can actually build the application. And UI5 has its custom module syntax. So what I had to do is to build a plugin for Webpack so it was able to understand the SAP UI5 module syntax. And I thought it's going to be easy. I just implement SAP UI define, SAP UI require. There are some different modes of SAP UI require where it's like an async load, and then you can specify a callback function. And in this case, it's an async load, and with the callback function is an async loading. And as I built my application, I found out I got a white screen, it's not running. And then I had to dig a little bit deeper into the code of UI5, and I found out, oh, there are SAP UI require sync statements, which is basically the same as the SAP UI require statement with only a string parameter. And SAP UI require is not only called as a function, but sometimes in the code it's called with .bind. So we also have to take care of this. And then there is the old syntax, jQuery sub require, which is used all over the code base in UI5. Maybe not in the core anymore, where a lot of things have been updated, but in the different control libraries. And some developers didn't follow the guidelines and wrote jQuery sub require, but they preferred to write a $sign. And as Webpack is statically analyzing the code, I also had to take care of this to find all the usages of $sub.require. And then there is another thing. UI5 does not only have JavaScript dependencies, but it's also loading a lot of resources, like the message bundles for the translations, CLDR files if you're using date formatting, and so on and so on. And I actually also wanted to put these files into my bundle because it's sending a lot of requests to the server all the time. So I had to basically replace the jQuery.sap.loadResource call. And in the latest UI5 versions, there is a new implementation of this whole thing. It's in the loader extensions, and it's called loadResource. So all of this had to be taken care of as well. And then it was still not done, because in some controls in the UI5 ecosystem, still global variables are used. So this is basically a whitelist in my code for all the controls that I found which use global dependencies like the sap.m.checkbox to replace those by also like a dependency that Webpack can understand. Ultimately, my goal was to completely get rid of the UI5 loader and only use the static analyzation in the beginning to build the application. But unfortunately, this was not possible because the loader is really baked into the core, and you cannot start the core without having the UI5 loader loaded, because then it will throw an exception. So the loader is still in there, and because of this, I had to write some codes or specify some specific resource routes in the UI5 configuration so that the loader thinks the UI5 was loaded with the SAP UI core.js, but it's actually not. So yeah, and after all of this was done, I was actually able to see the application. And we're going to have a look here now. It looks the same. And we can have a look at the tools again here. We reload it. And I have to say now, this is a very basic application. So if we look at our main bundle, it's also 500 kilobytes. And if we look at the coverage, it's basically the same. It's a little bit smaller, but this is as the tools, how they are now with the self-contained build, and Webpack are basically doing the same thing. But why is it a little bit smaller if they are doing the same thing? There's one thing that Webpack does different from the UI5 bundling, and this is all the async dependencies with SAP UI require. I implemented it like this, that for every async SAP UI require statement, a separate code chunk is generated. So there are a few places in the code already where this is implemented correctly, and for this, separate chunks of code are generated. And another nice thing about Webpack is that we don't need the debug sources anymore, because Webpack takes care of generating so-called source maps. So even though we only loaded the main.js here, if we go into the sources panel, I can search for any file that is in my bundle, for example, the app controller, and I can set my breakpoints in here without loading a lot of debug files with all these single requests, which takes a lot of time. And by the way, when we're already here, you can also see the code coverage of all your files while you're executing the applications, and you can maybe try to eliminate that code that's not actually used for your application. So another nice thing about Webpack is that it has a lot of tools that come with it, or it has a lot of big ecosystem. And one of these tools is called the Webpack Bundle Analyzer. And this enables us to actually look into the bundle, what's in there. And we can have a look at this for this simple sample application. And here we can see all the modules that are loaded for this simple application. And I looked at it and I thought, if we go back to the application, it's a simple page. You have a search field, you have another search field, you maybe have a checkbox, you have a segmented button down here. Why is the select control included in my bundle? There's another nice tool called Webpack Analyse, which enables us to dig deep into the dependency graph. So here we see also some statistics. So just for this simple application, 442 modules are included in the code. And we can go in here and search for the sub m select control. And here we see a list of reasons why this control was included into our bundle. And we can see the segmented button includes the select control, and that's why it's in the bundle. So let's check out the segmented button, why it's in there. And another nice thing is that you can actually see the code down here. and we can check the list of SAP UI define. No select control in here. But we can go down here in the code. There is a function, lazy load select form. The developer already made a nice note what would be the right thing to do here. Lazy load sub m select. Unfortunately, he chose to do the synchronous loading. And as we are statically analyzing the code, we beforehand have to include every file that is loaded synchronously. So this is why the select control is part of my bundle, even though it's never used in my application. And this is only one of the things that you can find. There are a lot of other nice things with functions that are deprecated since 0.9, which still have some synchronous requires in there. And yeah, because it's a sync require in the static analysis, I have to include it in the bundle. If we go back to the bundle analyzer, we can see that there is not only the main.js file here, but we have some other little files here. And this is actually where the few places where the SAP UI require asynchronous statement was used correctly. And this is in particular, if you scroll in a little bit, the SAP UI support module. So whenever you want to use anything from the SAP UI support module, this code is loaded asynchronously. So let's have a look at how all these different builds compare. You haven't seen the UI5 tooling with the preload, which I mentioned in the beginning now here, but I still put the statistics on the slide for you. So with the old tooling, with the preload loading, we were loading 7 megabytes of resources. The data transferred because of the gzipping on the server is only 1.6 megabyte. It's still a lot. With the OpenUI5 tooling in the self-contained build, there was already a big improvement. Only 3.6 megabyte of resources are loaded. And with the Webpack build, we only load 3.1 megabytes. And the data transferred is only 800 kilobytes. But as we just saw, there is still a lot of room for improvement there. And this is also because we have so much code that's not used. We have to kind of try to eliminate this. So this was only for a very small application, and I already mentioned this code splitting feature a lot, but because it was a simple application, we hadn't anything like this in there. So I built another example for you. It's basically a very simple application. You can see here an empty page, and what this application does is basically when we click on the load table button, it will load the table library and the XML view that has a table in it and will display it in here. And if you have a look at the network tab on the right, you will see that the table library is only loaded as soon as I click the button. So here we see there is 76 kilobytes loaded from the table library. And if we don't need it on our initial screen in the application, it's nice to load it asynchronously. We can have a look at the bundle analyzer as well for this bundle. And you can see we still have this really huge main bundle, but also we were able to move quite some code into a separate bundle, which only included the table library. And this is even, if you not only use OpenUI5, but SAP UI5, where you have a visualization library, this is even much bigger than the table library, and it's really useful to only lazy load it when the user actually wants to display a chart and not always load the library from the beginning. So how is this implemented? Let's have a look at the code. Is it big enough so you can read it?
Bigger is better.
Bigger is better. All right. So basically, the controller of the application I just showed you has just one function implemented that is supposed to load the table on the button click. And as you can see here, we have an asynchronous SAP UI require, which basically loads the table library and the unified library. The unified library is always required if you use the table library. We also use the message bundle, or include the message bundle that are needed by the table library, as well as the view that actually contains the table. And this statement is basically translated into a code split by Webpack by the implementation of the OpenUI5 Webpack plugin. So after all this load is done, the callback function resolves, and we can create the XML view with the name of the view that we just loaded and place it on the page. So it's actually really easy to split the code wherever you need it. Unfortunately, it's not very easy to split the code for every route in UI5 because most of the time the routes are specified in a manifest file. And the manifest file is a static JSON file, so it's really hard to translate these definitions into like dynamic require statements. You probably would have to implement a custom router to take care of this. So these were only small applications. I can actually also show you the application that I'm currently building and where we actually used the splitting by route, and you can see that multiple chunks of code are created. Unfortunately, the core always looks kind of big, so we would have to dig into this a little bit deeper to find out why all of these things are always loaded. But we can see that almost like 1/3 of the code is not needed initially to display the application, and that is why we can delay it. And of course, as less code we have to load initially, the faster the application shows up. Another nice thing, and in a moment I'm going to show you some code of our application, is that you can use any library that you can install with npm install. So because we are not using the SAP UI5 module system anymore, but rather Webpack is resolving the dependencies, we can also write require statements with like SAP UI require and then any library. For example, in our application, we are using Redux to do state management, and you can just require Redux and Webpack will resolve the dependencies. And this works for any dependencies that are in your Node modules folder. Another nice thing about Webpack is that you can use all the loaders that are already available. So if you want to write your code in TypeScript, no problem. If you write ES6 code and you want to transpile it with Babel, it's no problem. Just use the TypeScript loader or just use the Babel loader. So if we have a look just at the component file of the application, and it's not really necessary now to understand what's happening there, but you can see we are actually writing TypeScript files. We are using import statements like it's done in TypeScript. The component is created like a component is created with the UI component.extend, but the UI component is actually imported via from the package that's installed in npm. And I can write my code like however I want it to, and the plugin takes care of that all the dependencies to UI5 controls or modules that I have in my applications are resolved and taken care of so that we can run the application in the browser. So what do you have to do to build your application with Webpack? Well, there are multiple things. First, you have to create an entry point for your application. As we are not using the SAP UI5 module system anymore, and also not the SAP UI core.js, we have to manually load the core and initialize it. But this is only 5 lines of code. We can actually have a quick look at this. So this is basically the entry file for my application. We have to load some third-party files so that the application also works with browsers. This is also what usually the SAP UI core.js does. Then we include the UI5 loader because we have to, and the core. And our component manifest, and after that we just boot the application. And this is the sample application that I showed you earlier. Everything else of the code is the same as it's in the repository of the sample application. So I didn't touch anything else. Another thing that you have to do is, if you have a Webpack configuration, you have to now teach Webpack how to handle UI5. And there are multiple modules that I created to take care of this. First, the OpenUI5 Webpack plugin. The plugin itself hooks into the compiler of Webpack, and using the AST of all the code that is loaded, identifies all the places that we talked about earlier, SAP UI define, SAP UI require, and replaces them with a code that Webpack needs to basically put the bundle together. And then there are some loaders needed. Loaders in Webpack are kind of preprocessors for different files. So first up is the OpenUI5 XML loader. If you have an XML file, and Webpack is a JavaScript bundler, of course it cannot understand all the dependencies that we define, mainly all the controls that we are using in our XML views. So what the XML loader actually does, it looks at the XML, looks at all the namespaces that are defined on top of your XML view, then parses your view to check which controls are actually used, and internally in Webpack adds dependencies to all of these controls so that they are bundled into your final bundle. Next up is the OpenUI5 manifest loader. It's the same thing. We cannot understand all the dependencies that are defined in our manifest JSON files. There might be some models defined, or you might have some resources that you want to include in the application, or maybe you have a custom router that you want to use. So again, the manifest loader basically parses the JSON file, checks for any dependencies, and internally in Webpack adds all the dependencies, though it's put into the final bundle. Last thing, and this is unfortunately always needed, is the OpenUI5 renderer loader. This is a little bit hacky, but most of the UI5 controls don't specify a dependency to their renderer. So without that, we would have always some errors, could not find renderer for XYZ control. So this loader actually checks for every module in a specific path which you can specify with a regex. Is there a file, for example, the button, is there a button renderer? And if this is the case, then we also include it as a dependency in the bundle so that we can, so that it's part of the bundle in the end. So to summarize, what you can do by, what you can achieve by building your applications with Webpack, you're only including the dependencies that are really needed for your application. And this makes the bundle already smaller, but also this is a thing that the UI5 tooling can already do right now. Another thing that the UI5 tooling cannot do is split the code whenever you need it and only load the necessary code that's needed later in the application or whenever a user navigates to a later point. The async requires. It will also take care of all the resources, like translation files, to include it in your bundle. And you can specify which languages you want to include, so we can save some additional requests to the backend. Because of the nice feature of source maps in Webpack, we don't need to switch modes between debugging mode and actually the development mode of our files. And we always have a minified version that's loading fast in the browser, and we can use the source maps that are only loaded when we access actually the sources in the UI5 DevTools, which makes it a much nicer debugging experience when you develop the application. And of course, because of the big ecosystem around Webpack, there are a lot of existing tools that you can use to analyze what you actually put in your application and maybe which help you to improve your application in the end. Maybe one other thing to note at the end, this is only for the JavaScript part of UI5. And at the moment, the Webpack plugin supports building themes, but it will use the less OpenUI5 library, the same thing that the UI5 tooling is loading. It would be nice to, for example, if you have a button control, to only require the button less file if the button is actually loaded, but because of the way the libraries in less files are currently set up, where we have a library source.less file, which basically includes all the separate controls, and it's not really working. Actually, I tried to do some hacky thing where I was also doing like a file lookup if a less file for a specific control is available. But some controls not only use the less that's defined, for example, in the button.less file, but they also use some less definitions from other controls because maybe they were there already. So it's a little bit of a mess up in all these less files. So this could also be improved by like directly in the control requiring only the less files that are needed and then including the styles that are needed and maybe overriding some of the classes. Yeah, and with that, that's the overview of how you can build Webpack or UI5 applications with Webpack. One important thing on the bottom, the repository. This is where the code is available. You can have a look at it. You can download it. On there is also a link to the UI5 sample application, which is built with Webpack. And you can have a look at the Webpack configuration file, how to build and maybe copy it for your application. And then I would appreciate if you would let me know if it worked for you or not, or how I can improve this whole thing a little bit further. Yeah, thank you very much. And